Hi everyone and welcome at this virtual edition of our talk Tackling Socio-Technical Complexity in the Heart of Your Team. This is a little bit different than we're used to do it, but we are very much looking forward to do this online edition for XP2020. So my colleague Kenny and I will discuss this topic in this talk, and hopefully it will be fun. So we always like to start with an example or story outside of the IT world, and this is a typical situation for the Netherlands where we both live. These are the people that are taking care of, let's say, the green areas in our cities and our villages. And every time I see them working, I'm always thinking to myself, wow, is this really the most efficient, most productive or most effective way of working for them? And they are working in teams. These teams consist of multiple people, and they all have their different thing at the moment. One of them is shoveling leaves, the other one is blowing leaves, someone is shoveling around a bit, and there's always one person or two people that are just standing there. They are just standing there over their shovel and overseeing everything or overlooking everything, not sure what they're doing. But when I see this, I always think, well, there must be a more efficient or there must be a more effective way of doing this. And it seems like they're getting in each other's way even. Sometimes when one person is shoveling leaves, the other one is blowing them right back where they came from. And that seems very counterproductive. So the art here is really to observe without judging. And that is, of course, something that we like to do. We judge right away. But the thing is this really the most effective or optimized way for them to work? And maybe it is, because this is what we always try to do. We try to optimize in the best way possible from the best possible interests. And that is something that is going on in every industry, basically. So what we really need in order to optimize in the best possible way is the big picture. We need the bigger context, because eventually context is what shapes meaning. And that doesn't only hold for the people that we just saw on the previous slides, but it especially holds for everyone of us, the people that are working in the IT world. Right, Kenny?
Yeah, so how are we doing it right now in the IT world? So I've been a developer myself for many years. I now consult more than I really develop, but what I saw in the process myself was back then we went into a refinement, we planned our user stories, we gave them numbers, we pulled it in the sprint, and then we say, well, I'm going to work on this user story, and Evelyn will be using on the other user story. We're going back to our desks and typey. 1.5 weeks later, maybe 1 week, depending on the user story, we came back to each other and say, hey, maybe we should do some reviewing now. And this is what I felt back in the days, but I still see it happening, because what's happening is that at some point we need to start realigning. We go there, we do the review, and then it's like, well, I thought we had a good discussion before, but this seems a bit different than I would expect it to be, because my perception was different back then than the other person did. So what are we going to do? Well, we already spent it maybe 1 week on it, right? And well, there are some foundations that we cannot really add because it takes another week. So maybe we need to realign it a bit. And in software, that's a bit hard to see. But once you go and look outside, and here you see the stairs with the walls, you see, well, this is not really aligned well. But this is what we do each time. The longer the feedback it takes to realign again, this is bound to happen. And what are we going to do? Well, I see the staircase there. Maybe I'll just put there a little plank with some duct tape, because duct tape fixes everything, right? And we'll just leave it like there, and we'll fix it later. We'll just add it as a technical debt. Well, will never get fixed, because technical debt always ends up at the bottom, because next sprint you have the same issue. And in software, it's harder to see that it's happening. We never stood still about a proper design and a proper model, right? And what happens is there's a polarization here. It's a polarization I see happening again in other parts of the industry, now in the low-code industry, where the problem they say is, well, we're getting in each other's way, right? So on one hand, we want to be autonomous, we want to be individual, which is fine. There's a lot of good parts about it, because I can just sit there with my ears in and I can just start typing and be really effective. But on the other hand, we misalign. And that's the other part of this polarization. We're going to talk a bit more about that part there. But what makes you think that every time there is this polarization, individual versus team, that we can solve it just by giving each other a technical isolated part of the code? And these people getting their own environments isolated and they're working on it, just like me back there, is after a week I spent so much time there, and there's a fallacy which is called the sunk cost fallacy, because it says, why change now? We've already wasted so much, well, time in this case, but money as well, right? We never delete project because we already wasted 1 month on it. Prototypes move to production because we already wasted so much money in it. And that's the sunken cost fallacy, and it's really dangerous. I've spent now around 10, maybe 15 takes on this part, and we killed it a few times. We literally deleted it and needed to do it over because, well, this is the first time we're doing it. But it's really important to do it. But of course, there's, again, the polarization. You don't want to do it as often as possible. And that's the thing. Autonomy these days has become really compulsive.
Yeah, and that's completely in line with the optimization efforts that we are trying to do now. That can also lead to silos and us not talking to each other. And part of that is that we came up with this idea of autonomous teams as a holy grail. And it can be very effective, but we still need to remember that we are tribal creatures that require tribal safety. And these are things that we hardly ever think about when we try to optimize our delivery processes. Another thing that we tend to forget while optimizing our software delivery processes is this quote, and Nicole very beautifully formulated it. Investments in technology are also investments in people, and these investments will make our technology process more sustainable. We very often forget that we are also investing in people, or that we actually mainly investing in people. And the investments in technology that we do are more tangible and they are more concrete maybe, but the investments in people, that is what will make our technology process eventually more sustainable. So we need to find a way to balance that, and we need to be aware of that this balance exists in these investments that we're making. And that basically means that we are living and working in socio-technical systems. And Kenny mentioned the word before, but this is what we are dealing with. And it's up to us to create and maintain these socio-technical systems. And the solution here is that we need to observe our environment as socio-technical systems. So we are not just looking from a technical perspective, not just from a social perspective, and there are actually 3 aspects that we will get back to later. But this is a really, really important thing. Because very often what we see happening in organizations and teams is that we are focusing on technical issues. And we believe that most of the technical issues that we're dealing with are actually a consequence of organizational issues. So there's this fine balance between people and technology. And proper socio-technical systems take into account all these aspects and all these factors, and they balance them. So that means that we cannot just focus on one aspect. If we make a technical decision, then we need to be aware of what it does to our culture, to our systems, and to our teams. And it's of course also the other way around. But we will get back to that later in this talk.
Okay, so let me give you a few examples in our domain about social technical. We've discussed already the one where the feedback loop needs to be shortened, and that's mostly a social aspect. Of course, there's also something technical in there. But the first part I want to talk about is DevOps. So I always make the joke here in the company I've worked with, is I just get a sticky, I write down Dev and Ops, put it on the wall where the team sits, and I say, well, we're DevOps, right? We're sitting next to each other. And I hope a lot of people recognize this, that's not DevOps, right? It's more than just putting the people together. That's a technical aspect. Putting them together, give them connection to all the tools, and it will be fine. Well, actually, it won't be fine because we're lacking a lot of social and cognitive aspects here. Because one thing there, and this actually comes from system thinking, is shifting the burden to the intervener. Before they were two separate teams. And they were doing what's called shifting the burden to the intervener. So the dev team threw their code to the run team, so to the ops team, and say, well, here's my code, just put it to production. And just run it in production. That's not my thing. So the thing that the run people and ops people were worried about is getting that stable in production. The thing the devers were talking about was changing. And these are 2 colliding things. So the dev don't optimize for ops anymore. And this happened to me the same. I was sitting in a so-called DevOps team, well, DevBus, Ops, you know all the names, right? It's just working together. And I found myself at some point typing my change and write the Jira report. I'll allocate it to the person that's sitting right across from me, which was the opser, right? Because that person could put it to production. So the processes didn't change, but the mindset also didn't change there. And from that point on, I was thinking, this is not so good. Let's have a discussion. I'm going to sit next to him. Well, that's a challenge now, but I'm going to work together with him. It's not a challenge. If you want to do it, you can sit together and show each other how it's done. Get to know what the other person's perception is. And that's what we often forget. We just put teams together and think it will be fine. But there's a lot of ideas, especially ideas that can help us improve that process. So that's called shifting the burden to the intervener. And the second thing is, and this takes us a while back, well, especially most of us, when we were still sitting at offices mostly, and these open spaces were there. And the open spaces came from a lot of background. There's a really great talk about that, where it came from. But the thing is here, open spaces. We all started to use it before COVID came in. And what happens when you go into an open space? Again, isolation, because people need to isolate themselves. People need to just work. There's all this noise going around, and that's again the cognitive and social aspect. There's a lot of cognition going on there. I always see it as a cat, right? Just put a cat somewhere and we'll find a box. Why? Just to remove that social cognitive aspects of it. And this is what you will see in a lot of open spaces when we return back. And we all get back to our work after this part of COVID-19 isolation. These open spaces won't work anymore, and this will be your next step, right? The things on your head, because we're so used to that isolated thing. And maybe 3 months ago, this looked a bit weird to us, or as we say in Dutch, das gek. But maybe that's now the new normal, and it's not so weird that it's happening that first people start to implement these open spaces.
True.
Right?
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. But to really understand that, we have to take a little sidestep. And for that little sidestep, we need to go back in time a bit. And actually, we need to go back to World War II, somewhere deep in the Pacific Ocean. And at that time, there were tribes living in the Pacific Ocean. And all of a sudden, they saw these big metal birds in the sky. They just appeared in the sky. We also know these things as airplanes. But they had never seen them. They had never seen this technology. They had never seen these big metal things flying around in the sky. So that was new to them. So the thing was that these big metal birds gave them free food and cargo, which is where the name comes from. So they were actually really happy with this metal bird. So they gave them something positive. And at one point they were even thinking, well, this must be our ancestors giving us free stuff and giving us a better life, because, yeah, that's what we deserve. But as we know, World War II ended at one point, and so these big metal birds stopped coming and stopped giving them free stuff. So what they did then, once they stopped coming, they built the exact same thing made out of wood. So they just started copy-pasting what they saw. But they didn't know the technology, they didn't know what was inside, how it worked, they didn't really have all that context. So they just started building what they were seeing and started placing these things on their island, including landing strips and all. That is what they did. And of course, nothing happened because, yeah, there was no cargo involved and they built those things themselves. But they started copy-pasting stuff because this was working, it was good, we want to have that, so we are just going to copy this and paste it. And this is not only happening there, this is also happening in our IT world. And there's also a thing that's called cargo programming, which is actually the art of programming by coincidence. And that means that we are just copying stuff without really knowing what it's doing or how it will benefit us. We're just copying stuff because it worked for someone else, so it should work for us as well. We see that with the Spotify model, with Google, all sorts of stuff. And the thing is that Simon Wardley said it perfectly actually. You should certainly take universally useful principles, but you need to also be mindful of how your culture will react or respond. There is something useful in every methodology or in every thing or every new kid on the block. I mean, lean, agile, DevOps, waterfall even. There are useful principles in there, but you cannot just copy and paste everything. You need to be mindful of how it will affect your culture. What will something do to the rest of my organization, to my culture? What is a technical decision going to do to our culture, to our relationships, to our teams? So you have to really critically look at these universally useful principles and see what will work for your culture and what will not. And a great example of this, and Kenny already mentioned it in the beginning of this talk, are the open office spaces. these forms of spaces, of office spaces, were supposed to improve communication. But in fact, they are not really improving communication. They are also not cheaper than any other form of office spaces. This is actually the most expensive office space that you can get. And it actually results in more burnouts. People are not happy. People start to isolate themselves with all the headphones and the cubicles, trying to get a cubicle in an open office space. This is actually not working for people. This is a very dysfunctional way of working together. And yet, most of us are in an open office space because we simply copy-pasted it from a company where it did work. And that is a perfect example of something called socio-technical complexity. And that is what we are going to talk about today as well. Because the open office spaces, for example, technically it's all possible. But socially, it's doing something to your culture. It's really doing something to how you're working together and how your teams are collaborating. And socio-technical complexity can result in losing the big picture, the sense, a shared understanding, and vision and mobilization among the team. And that is something that you do not want. So this socio-technical complexity is the result of technical aspects, cognitive aspects, and social aspects, and especially the interrelationship between these three. And we're going to discuss all three of them. So Kenny, you're going to start, right, with the technical one?
Yeah. Okay, so the technical aspect here. So what do we mean with the technical aspect? It's the rational part, right? It's what we see. It's the architecture that we build around. It's the tools we use. It's the tables we use. It's the laptops you use. These are the technical aspects, and they're tangible for us. But it's also the techniques we use. For instance, test-driven development. For instance, perhaps Scrum. These can also be part of the technical aspects. And there's a really interesting part is that we generally, again, copy-paste things that work in different contexts without us knowing in what habitat do we live. So it would be really weird if I put on a bathing suit and go to the Arctic Pole and jump in there. So my habitat is really important here in the technical aspect. And this is what we usually don't take into account when we have these discussions about these technical aspects. It's the habitat, again, also the cultural aspect. So we use, in our daily work, we use the Kinev Framework. And the Kinev Framework is there to give you a habitat to know in which sense do I need to respond. So there's 4 domains here, plus a 5th one. So the 5th one is probably where you're in now, which is disorder. You don't know where you are, so you don't know how to act. And the first one is quite obvious. It's called obvious. And it's the area of where when you see it, you know how to do it. So then you sense, you see, you categorize, oh, this is this problem, and you respond to that problem. For us in the Netherlands, it's changing a keg of beer. It's what I usually do. Most Dutch people know how to change a keg of beer, even though most people might not even drink beer. But they know, they see it, oh, that's the keg, we open it, there's just one thing you need to be accountable for, and you respond. So that's the obvious part. Complicated is still in the ordered domain, that's the right side, and we call it ordered because it always behaves the same. There's no change in behavior. But complicated is a bit more complicated, like I don't know how to make or repair a watch, but a watchmaker knows, and the watchmaker can open the watch and put it back together, and the watch still, if the person did a good job, still works the same. So it's still ordered, it's still non-changeable. What we do is we sense, we analyze, and respond. And here is where good practices come in. In the obvious domain, there are best practices. So every time I hear the word best practices, no, probably not, because if something is obvious, then someone else might have already built it. So that's the right side, and that's the ordered domain. Let's move to the left side, which is complex and chaotic. It's unordered. What do we mean? Is that there's no correlation between input and output. So behavior changes over time. So if I do something now, so let's say I hit someone in the face, might be a bit chaotic there, but when I hit someone in the face, the next time the person will probably behave differently because that person will expect me to do it. And here we need to probe more. We need to know what works and what doesn't work. So we need safe to fill probe. And that's what we mean probe, sense, and response. And we have emergent practices. And every time you're dealing with humans, you're probably in a complex domain. And then the last one is chaotic. It's when the fire drill comes in. What do? You act, you sense, and respond. Why am I telling you this? Because every time we make decisions on the technical aspect, the tooling, the architecture, be mindful of your habitat. Be mindful that if I do TDD and I don't know yet what the behavior is, so I'm far on the left side of the complex area, then maybe I won't start with TDD because I do some cheap safe to fail probes, but as soon as one probe hit, I might start now delete the prototype and start doing TDD. You might as well use TDD in the complex side, but first we need to discover more. So first we need to probe more. This probe doesn't need to be code, it can also be event storming or something else, or just really good user research. And that's why this Kinev Framework for us is really important. And one thing to mention before we go to the next part is it goes around. So it goes from chaotic, complex, complicated to obvious, and it can also go back to chaotic. And once you fall off into the chaotic domain, it's really hard, maybe even impossible to go back to obvious. You need to go to complex, complicated, obvious again. So be mindful if you're in the obvious domain, be mindful because that keg that we just changed of beer, if you did one thing wrong, it might explode and you wasted your entire keg. So now we have this framework, and now we jump into the next stage, which is our meeting rooms. Well, they look a bit different now, but we still have the same behavior because every time, let's say we're in the complex domain where we need to probe more, but let's say we talk about complex things, then we also doing it like this, sitting around or now sitting behind your table, looking at Zoom, and we're not interacting with each other, we're just talking. So as a team, you're sitting in this room now, Zoom meetings or Teams meetings or whatever tool you're using, and as a team, the first PO is there, and there's maybe several POs because we need to collaborate. We need to do this together. And then the first PO is explaining, well, go this way, go that way. It's just like this Portuguese sketch of our colleague showed us represents this, right? The first PO, go left, and giving direction. This person giving direction to where to go, giving vision for your product. But then the second one comes in.
Yeah, because it never stops after one. And as you see in the sketch, the second PO already entered the scene, and this person has his or her own ideas again, and he or she wants to tell a story and wants to be heard, and has better ideas of how to get where we want to go. So instead of listening to each other, we are talking to each other, and there's even a third PO coming into the scene with another set of ideas and another set of beliefs, and we are all fighting for our own beliefs. And at the beginning, this collaboration thing is pretty friendly, and we try to listen to each other, and we are still talking, and it's all a little bit friendly. But maybe you recognize this if you've been in such a meeting, that at some point it doesn't get that friendly anymore. I mean, we are starting to getting into conflicts, we are starting to argument with each other, and it's not that friendly anymore. And that is exactly what's happening in this video as well, because we all have our beliefs on how to get somewhere, and we want to get those ideas across. And what we end up with is a lot of socio-technical complexity that we need to solve in a way.
Yeah, and as you see the reaction of the lady this time, which represents a team, is like, okay, what do you want me to implement now?
And it's not that weird that you're feeling lost, and that the fact that you are feeling lost has something to do with cognitive bias. And that has a kind of a negative association, but in fact these things are most of the time they are really, really helpful. A bias is a mental shortcut that we are using to make sense of the world, because on a daily basis there is so much information and so much impulses coming at us, and we need to process everything and we need to make sense of it. And while we're doing that, we also need to be productive and need to function properly as a human being. So these biases help us make sense of the world. And there's actually something called System 1 and System 2, and if you want to know a lot more about that, then I definitely recommend to read Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman. But just to give you the brief summary of it, we have a System 1 that we are using 95% of the time. And in this System 1, we are using a lot of heuristics and biases. And these are just the mental shortcuts that we are using. It's the reason that you do not have to overthink everything that you're doing. It's the reason that you didn't have to think about every single little decision that you had to make in order to get your breakfast ready, for example, this morning. It's a really, really helpful tool that we're having in our brain. And there's a System 2 that is more slow, and it's more deliberate, and it's more thoughtful, and that is the system that we are using to make the more complex or more rational decisions. And because we are using System 1 95% of the time, that leaves us with some time to spend with our System 2. And in some cases that's really, really useful because, for example, like Kenny mentioned, the sunk cost fallacy, that's an example of a cognitive bias. We hold on to stuff because we are invested in it emotionally, financially, and that is not always the best idea. It's not always the best foundation for us to make or to base decisions on. So if we are aware of these cognitive biases that are at play, if we are aware of what's happening and how they are affecting our decisions, for example, then we can deliberately think of these things, actively activate our system too, and make a more rational decision. And instead of holding on to something desperately, even while it's not the best or the most rational decision, then we can overcome that. And that is a very helpful tool. So being aware of these biases, being aware of what's going on, is a really helpful tool. The bad news here is that it's not just about a handful of biases. Actually, there are quite a lot of them. And this is an overview, and this is a never-ending overview. But this is a really, really good starting point. And the thing that I like about this thing is that it's categorizing stuff. And I like to categorize stuff, so this is really something for me. But it divides all these biases in 4 categories. So what should we remember? Too much information, not enough meaning, and need to act fast. And I would definitely recommend to go through these biases, to these codex on a rainy Sunday afternoon, for example, and just start looking at this. Because if we are aware of all the things that are affecting our behavior and our decision making and our teamwork and how we collaborate as a team, then we might be able to better understand what we're doing. We might be better able to make more rational and less biased decisions. And that will probably help us in general. So this is a very, very interesting thing to go over. And if you want to know more, like I said, the book Thinking Fast and Slow is a really, really good starting point. So the movie that we just saw, there's also a bias related to that movie. And the most prominent bias at that point is this one, the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. And that is about the limits that we have on our capacity to process information. If there's too much information coming at us, we just stop. We hit a limit and we cannot process it anymore. So if there are a bunch of POs or other people telling you stuff and convincing you of some information, then it's just simply too much. You cannot process it, and you won't be able to handle that in a proper way. So if there's too much complexity, we will fail and process everything. So to illustrate how our brain works, I want to do a simple experiment, and I've never done this online or virtually, so I'm hoping that it will work the same. So don't worry, this will be a very simple exercise. We are going to count beans. I hope we all agree that this is 1 bean. I cannot check on consensus because you are there and this was pre-recorded. But I'm going to show you some slides. I'm going to ask you to count the beans, and I'm going to show you the slides for just 1 second. So we're going to start. How many beans did you saw? This is still rather easy, right? This is still doable. We're going to do it again. How many beans did you saw? This is the moment that we usually have some interaction with the audience. But so the answer might differ here. So we're going to do it 1 more time. So the last one was probably easier to do. And there's a reason that the last one was easier than the one before that. And that has to do with visualization. The last example was visualized in such a way that it is easier to deal with that complexity. And visualization is not just valuable when you're counting beans, but it also really helps in meetings. But Kenny, you can tell us all about that, right?
Yes. So there's a great book by David Sibet called Visual Meetings. And David Sibet is not the only one who discusses that we need to use visualization in meetings. There's Ruth Malan that talks about visual architectures. And these are already wisdoms we have for many years. But the thing I like most about this book is it gives you clear templates to work with and to organize these things the same as the beans you just saw organized. And that what went wrong with the video, if you think back, is the person, the lady, didn't have the map. If they would have the map and let them show on the map where to go, then the complexity is easier to handle and it's easier to get into it. And that's in where we come from, is the DDD scene. We talk about visual collaboration tools. And me and Joao, a colleague of mine, curated a book by a lot of authors that talk about these many collaboration tools you can use in your team to tackle these complexities. Right? You have example mapping, you have impact mapping, context mapping, event storming, which is actually one of my favorite. And these tools are all there to create a shared sense of reality, to show others your perception without judging. That's what Evelyn talked about at the start, judging. First, let everyone speak their mind out, what they mean, and let's share afterwards. Organize it, structure it, and that's where these visual tools comes in handy. And again, don't copy paste, don't think there's one tool to rule them all. No, there's many of these forms. So, great. My favorite one to start with is event storming. When we talk about processes or stories, I'm going to visualize with event storming. And I'm going to get people inside the room. Well, now it will be more virtual, which is also possible. But you get them into a room. Will it work now? No, because apart from the cognitive aspects that we're tackling with these things, not all, there's many more, but there's also a social aspect. And the social aspect goes more about ranking. Who decides? Where are the borders? Who do I like? Who don't I like? And especially who don't I like? So what do you observe about this picture? Well, most people will see it's the bird hanging upside down, right? And the other birds are like, what is this bird doing? And in the Netherlands, there's two Dutch anthropologists who came with a name, Harry. And it's a Dutch thing, but Harry represents for the people who are a bit weird or a bit quirky. Why they came into a meeting and a workshop, they explained these social aspects, and then someone says, oh, that's Harry, he is always the weird person. Right, Evelyn?
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be a Harry. I mean, for me, it could also be a Kenny or a Paul or a Pim or a Joao, and those are my teammates, and those are the Harrys for me in a team. But the reason that we see these Harrys or that we perceive these people has everything to do with cognitive bias again. So the reason that we see this Harry person as weird or different has everything to do with cognitive biases again. And the specific bias that's at play here is the fundamental attribution error, which has a lot to do with stereotyping. And having these stereotypes, which is also a form of cognitive bias, is in essence very useful because it helps us to formulate a judgment pretty quickly about someone. And if we would have to do that deliberately or consciously, that would take us all day if we have to evaluate every person or every situation. So these stereotypes in principle are very helpful, but they can also hinder us. And that is what happens when the fundamental attribution error takes over. So this cognitive bias says something about how we view others and how we view ourselves. So as an example, if someone else writes a bug, it's because they are an idiot or just a bad developer, or it's just because of them. If I'm writing a bug, it's because of a lot of situational factors. I had a really rough night of sleep. There was a lot of noise. I had to do a lot of context switching. It was just not my day. There were lots of reasons why I wrote that bug. So what we do here is that we overemphasize personal characteristics and we ignore situational factors. And that can really, really harm us. So we have to be aware of that this is going on. So if you think about someone and think, hey, that's a Harry, then that might have to do with the fact that you just not know that person well enough. If we get to know someone, we will be able to take these situational factors into account, and we will formulate a better judgment or a better stereotype about someone. We will create a better image of someone. So we will understand that person better. So it's all about just getting to know someone, and not just about what they're doing, but what kind of person is this? What does this person like to do in their free time? Do they have children? Just the personal stuff about someone really helps you to overcome this fundamental attribution error.
And there's an interesting book written by two Dutch anthropologists again that they say, well, we need to do meetings more as campfires, getting to know each other. And getting to know each other's perception, getting loose of the fundamental attribution error, getting more of an equal time to say what you really want to say. So I give trainings and workshop, and the first thing I will say in a training and workshop is, why do you want to be here? But also, why do you don't want to be here? Because that's also usually the issue, and that's usually what's not being spoken about. But me as a trainer, I might not want to be there. I have this, I once did this workshop with a colleague of mine, and the colleague was, and when we didn't do this, the colleague was standing in the back, doing this all the time, and I'm like, what is this guy's problem? Come on, we need to facilitate this workshop. But little did I know, the person has needed an operation of his tooth. It was hurting so much, and is a valid reason of not being there. So maybe he should have moved, maybe we as a group discussed it, and then says, well, I'm going home, or maybe he would stay, but now I know that sometimes he has pain in his tooth. And that's why we need to start with meetings as a campfires. And from Deep Democracy, there's this thing called the check-in, where we discuss this. This is the question I just gave you: do you want to be here, or why don't you want to be here? And then everyone gets their time, whenever they want to, but there's no dialogue. Everyone can speak their mind and put their mind on the table. And that's a great start. And then the next thing that's really important here in the social aspect is really listening to that other person. Can you really unsee your own and see theirs? So like here, I see a rabbit. But if I want to see the duck, I first need to unsee the rabbit before I can see the duck. And this is an easy example, but if you go back to the fundamental attribution error, is this cat grumpy, or is it your fundamental attribution error? When you have dogs and cats, the reason why they cannot get along is that a cat moves its tail when it's annoyed, and a dog moves its tail when it's happy. And there you have your fundamental attribution error. So that's why if they don't learn each other from birth, they don't know that, and when they go on the street, they will fight each other. And these are our simple examples, but there's a lot more harder examples. Maybe most of you know this, right? So, do you want to be accurate, or do you want to be complete? If I'm accurate here, I say, well, this is gold and blue. But if I want to be complete, then someone else would say, well, this is black and blue. So we need to be complete, and especially that's the important part of the social aspect. Because the real power sits deep below the unconscious. If we can really speak our mind freely and really say what we have to say as a group, the group has so much wisdom and potential, and we make so much more powerful and sustainable decisions just by grasping this social aspect. And we do that with the Deep Democracy, the Lewis method, a really nice structured way to dive into. Because when we don't lay these things on the table, and when people don't tell or want to say what they need to say, then something called the sabotage line will run. And we call it resistance, right? So it starts with jokes, excuses, we do a little gossiping, and it's normal, everyone does this. This is I like the poor stopped communication at some time. I will just go, okay, I'll go my own way. So everyone has their thing. And that's on its disruption. And right now we have a lot of striking and war separation in the world, right? Because it's really hard, the racism that's going on. That's the sabotage line. But it's not resistance. It's another person's idea. And that idea might actually be a great idea, or we can add that idea to our own idea. It just needs to come from a basis of being equally different. And that's it. The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, to be seen, heard, and companioned, exactly as it is. We can all understand that maybe someone has a better idea, as long as we feeling a part of this new idea, as long as we get observed, we're witnessed, we're human, we have human interaction. And that's what we want. And when you go back to tackling the social technical complexity in your team, who actually does this? Well, bluntly, everyone can do this. In the book that Jitske and Daniela talks about magicians, that's why it's a nice background. And we need magician skills. Look back at the tribes. It's usually the magic that's happening. It's in between the interactions. Something's happening. Something is brewing. When all these different things start popping up, the social, the cognitive, and the technical, something magically that we cannot explain happens. That's actually called human interaction and culture. And that's what we want, and everyone can do this. Usually in a team, it's a scrum master that get these skills, right? There are skills that you can read up on in the visual collaboration book that we curated, and you can download for free at the Leanpub, which is based on building tribes. But sometimes you might as well get someone else from another team to do this for you, because you're so deep inside your own communication and your bias in the team that you need outside eyes, and sometimes someone external from your company. So, but everyone can do this, just you need someone with experience.
All of this means that in the end, this is what it comes down to. When you start judging, you stop listening and you stop learning. And even though it makes sense for us to start judging right away, because that's just how we are wired, how our brains work, using our system 1 most of the time, but it's really important to be aware of that, so that you are able to take a step back and that you don't judge right away, and that you know how to overcome certain biases, and that you can wait with the judging part a little bit. So it's really important that you get to know all of the situational factors that might affect someone's behavior or a certain decision-making process. And that you don't just base your judgment on personal characteristics of the other person. So what we want to conclude with are a few takeaways. We listed a few of them. So when we think about tackling socio-technical complexity, it's really important to be aware of the socio-technical complexity that is aware in your team, that you are operating in a socio-technical system that you need to create, maintain and design. That you can use the Kinev Framework as a sense-making device to aid decision-making. You need to be aware of the cognitive biases that are at play. That doesn't mean you have to know all of them and you have to recognize all of them, but being aware that it's happening, being able to reflect on certain situations, that is really helpful. And know that visualizing complexity can help you in creating and maintaining that shared sense of reality, or that shared understanding. And that having meetings as campfires will also help you to increase the understanding and decrease the amount of assumptions that we're making in a team. So these are just a few of the tips or the takeaways that we hope that we got across in this virtual talk. That marks kind of the end of our talk. Yeah, so that was it. That's the end of our talk. We really enjoyed it. It was a little bit different, of course, the first online version of a talk. We hope it was fun for you as well. We also hope that you kind of disagree with some of the things that we were saying, and we would love to discuss this further. So if you have any questions or you want to talk about something, reach out to us on Twitter or LinkedIn or via any other way that you can imagine. That's it, right?
That's it, yeah. And thank you for listening again. And remember, don't start judging. Leave that over to our cats.
Thank you.